This week's speaker is our colleague, Charlotte Eubanks, who is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature, Japanese, and Asian Studies in our department, where she's been since 2006. She teaches courses in world literature, literary Buddhism, Japanese culture, book history, and visual studies. She's the author of many articles, which have appeared in venues such as Ars Orientalis, Verge, Studies in Global Asia, Symposium, the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies, Word and Image, and Book History, as well as a fantastic entry on the new orality that she wrote for the ACLA's most recent State of the Discipline report. That's both online and then in the book version of the State of the Discipline report that came out last year. Her books, beyond the articles, include the monograph Miracles of Book and Body, Buddhist Textual Culture and Medieval Japan, which was published in 2011, and is a study of the relationship between the human body and sacred text in the Buddhist literary tradition. And her next book is titled The Art of Persistence, Akamatsu Toshiko and the Visual Cultures of Transwar Japan, a microhistory, as she says, of the artist, memoirist, and activist Akamatsu Toshiko, also known as Maruki Toshi, and I'll give you his dates, although I'm sure Charlotte will cover some of this in the talk today as well, who was alive from 1912 to 2000. This book is forthcoming from the University of Hawaii Press later this year. Her next book, which she's already at work on and from which she's already published articles, is tentatively titled Performing Mind, Zen Poetry and the Enacting of Consciousness, which will take a kind of performance studies-oriented approach to the work of 13th century Zen master Dogen, which I think I mispronounced, Charlotte, didn't I?
No, you got it right.
As soon as someone tells me how to pronounce something, I forget it. Before that, I was doing pretty well. Part of the reason I went through these publications to give you a sense of the breadth of Charlotte's work and the many centuries that her work moves across. One last sort of professional note is that beyond her work as a scholar, beyond her work in this department, she was our Director of Graduate Studies for several years, for 3 years, is that Charlotte does a lot of work in the field and in the profession in terms of structuring the study of Asian studies within Asian studies and then in more general associations like the MLA. She was a previous member of the executive committee for the Forum on East Asia to 1900 at the MLA and a founding chair of the Forum on Japan to 1900 at the MLA when the forum underwent restructuring a few years ago. She also serves as associate editor of the journal Verge, Studies in Global Asia, which is based here at Penn State, even though it's published by Minnesota. So please join me in welcoming our speaker.
All right, well, thanks so much, everybody, for coming out today. I'm used to speaking in front of large classes, and I don't usually lapel mic myself, so if I start screaming at some point, just like put your hands to your ears or tell me to stop, because I'm just trying to project to the back rows there. What I'm going to do today is to talk to you a little bit about this book project that I'm just finishing that's coming out, as Madali said, from the University of Hawaii Press later this year. In the Q&A, if you ask me questions that are groundbreaking and ground-shaking, I might just faint on the floor because the book manuscript is already set. There's not much I can do to change it. But at any rate, I don't know why I said that. I'm nervous. I'm nervous because the only other time I was in front of this room giving a talk in this particular venue was my job talk, which apparently went well. So hopefully this will do well as well. I also really like things. I like, as Molly was saying, I published in book history and word and image and things like that. So I like the material stuff of books. So in a little bit, I'll pass around some books that you can look at and that sort of thing. They've been colored in and crayoned in and scribbled in, and they're like 60 years old, so I'm not particularly worried about potato chips and stuff. So anyway, you're in good shape. So I'm going to be talking at 3 different scales in some ways. I'm going to be talking at the largest at a kind of conceptual scale. And in the conceptual realm, what I'm looking at is kind of this idea of persistence. Persistence, and this is before, was it Elizabeth Warren? And then she persisted. Okay, so the title of the book is there before Elizabeth Warren. I just she took it from me, not the other. So at the conceptual scale, I'm really going to be talking about this idea of persistence. This is an idea that's useful and interesting to me, primarily in the field of Japanese studies, where people are still really working to kind of try to come to terms with what the heck happened in Japan between, say, 1930 and 1945. That horrible experience in imperialism and fascism. And as I'll mention a little bit here in a bit, there tends to be a dialogue around this kind of so-called dark valley, or anya, of 1937 to 1945, where there's sort of a before 1937 and then after 1945, and things kind of disappear in that chasm in between. I was interested in this artist because she lived across that chasm. She published actively in every single year on either end of that chasm. And I was interested in the ways in which delving into her life could come up, or could help me come up with conceptual tools for talking about how people lived and produced culture across that dark chasm. A way of kind of getting away from these logics of complicity on the one hand and resistance on the other, and kind of trying to map out some territory with more texture between those things. I'll also be talking at a more precise level about this particular artist. Her name is Akamatsu Toshiko, or Maruki Toshi. She preferred to go by the name Toshi, which is what I'll just refer to her as over the course of this talk. And I'll give you a little bit of information about her as an individual artist, activist, and author. Then I'm going to drop down to an even more material level and talk specifically about the types of things that she published in and around the year 1945. So I'll be kind of ratcheting between those three different levels there. So she's most famous for this series of bitingly anti-nuclear, anti-war panels that she created between 1948 and the late 1980s with her husband, Maruki Iri. And you see a little snippet of it right over here. I'll show you a bigger picture of it in a moment. This opening quote, when I talk about the artist to people who are in Japan studies, is very shocking to them. Toshi was, and still is, almost sainted in Japan for her anti-war and anti-nuclear sentiments in particular. And yet she writes in her own memoir, which she published in the 1970s, that she had this particular conversation with an American GI where she actually thanks him for dropping the atomic bomb and killing the fascists. That is something that has been deeply kind of covered up and not talked about very much in Japanese history. How could someone who was so anti-war and anti-nuclear have expressed thanks? And so I wanted to kind of use that quote as a little bit of a touchstone. I'll come back to it several times in the talk today. So a little bit of information then on the project. So Maruki Toshi was born Akamatsu Toshiko in 1912 and lived until the year 2000. She was a real powerhouse in 20th century Japan as an artist, as an activist, as an author, and I'd be happy to talk more about the ways in which author and artist were intertwined identities and are still intertwined identities in the long Japanese tradition, such that they're not actually separable, in my opinion. She's most well known for her series of Hiroshima panels, which look something like this. They're about the size of this whole wall. So they're life-size and sometimes even somewhat larger. These were co-created with her husband and collaborator Maruki Iri, as I mentioned, between 1948 and 1980. And almost all scholarship, certainly in English, unless it's been published and also in Japanese, again, unless it's been published by me or about two other people, all the scholarship really focuses on this set of panels, for good reasons, and I'd be happy to talk about why. But doesn't have any commentary on the rest of her other work. She does, however, have this enormous Transwar oeuvre, which includes a ton of different genres, and I'll just give you a snapshot of some of those. Sorry, here she is with her husband. Here, Toshi is down the bottom left, her husband displaying these things. But a little bit about kind of the broader corpus. She wrote proletarian wall fiction, kabe shousetsu. Right? It's a fairly common genre in China, Japan, and Korea in the 1930s. She also wrote hundreds of articles and illustrated them for women's magazines throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s. She illustrated a whole bunch of children's books, like this one, which is set in Singapore. She did a bunch of oil paintings. She was classically trained as an oil painter. That's her uncle. She did thousands of sketches from across the Japanese empire, this one from Micronesia. She kept diaries. Her handwriting is almost as horrible as mine, I can attest. It was a pain to read. She wrote newspaper columns on everything from gender equality to the Tokyo war crime tribunals, which she illustrated, and which she witnessed firsthand. Over the last decade then, I've been doing this really deep dive into the full archive of her works, which involved getting access to a bunch of family materials, privately held materials, and temple materials, museums, and things like that. So I'm also happy to talk about the archival process in Q&A if you'd like to hear more about that. But the reason that I've been getting into her artwork is not just because I find her an interesting person individually, but because I'm interested in the ways in which she can help me tell a larger story that would be about understanding, charting, and theorizing Transwar Japanese visual culture. So that's what the book is about, kind of just give you a snapshot of the book. Here are the 6 chapters. I'll be talking about material from chapter 5 there in just a bit here. So in the book, I'm examining the relationship between visual verbal culture in Japan and politics over the Transwar era. And I'm getting at these via a microhistory of this artist, Toshi. Scaling up from the details of her lived experience to address major events in Japanese history, including colonization and empire, war, the nuclear bombings, the Tokyo War Crime Tribunals, and the Transwar proletariat movement. So more broadly, I also outlined this ethical position called persistence, which I'll sketch in toward the conclusion. So that's the kind of broad stretch, or broad scope of the argument, and you can see kind of where we're situated there toward the end of the argument. So I'll try to provide a little bit of scaffolding before we get to the particular materials. So Akamatsu Toshiko herself, this is a self-portrait, Rosie the Riveter-like, from right after the war, is a microcosm of Imperial Japan. She was born to a settler colonial family in 1912 in what's now the prefecture of Hokkaido, on the very northern end of the Japanese islands. In 1929, she won admission to an arts college, the Joshi Jujutsu Senmon Gakko, in Tokyo, and she was one of the first generation of women to receive training in the Western genre of oil painting, which was understood as a military art form at the time. And again, I can explain why in Q&A if you'd like to know. She graduated in 1933 and spent 4 years as an elementary school teacher, primarily as an arts teacher, but was somewhat distressed by the increasingly militaristic atmosphere of teaching at the time. So she quit her post in March 1937 and took a job working as a governess and a nanny for a diplomatic family that was stationed in Moscow. Crazy thing to actually be in the middle of proletarian purges in Japan at the time, and then to go spend time hanging out with the Communist Youth Brigade in Moscow, which is the subject of an earlier chapter of the book. She spent over a year there and actually did a second stint working for a different diplomatic family in 1939. She also spent extensive time in the Japanese Mandate in Micronesia, most of a year there. The Mandate in Micronesia were territories, specific territories, in this box down here, that were awarded to Japan after World War I by the League of Nations. Japan was deemed to be, this is not a quote, but a summation, not white, but the closest thing to it in the Pacific, right? The source of civilization and enlightenment in the Pacific. It's an incredibly racist document that awards the Mandate in Micronesia, which had been in German hands, to Japan, at any rate. She returned after spending about a year there to her atelier in the artist neighborhood of Ikebukuro, which is right outside of Tokyo, where she married the Hiroshima-born surrealist poet and ink brush painter Maruki Ii. In 1945, of course, when the atomic bombing of Hiroshima happened, she and her husband got on a train as soon as they could to go down to Hiroshima to see if anybody had survived, to offer help from them, and they spent about a month there helping surviving family members. After the war, she and Edie were really deeply involved in a whole bunch of progressive social and artistic movements, and are most famous for this kind of nuclear series, which they began in defiance of occupation-era dictates on censorship. They completed the series in 1989, and in 1995 they were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. At any rate, to return to the argument then, now that you know a little bit about Toshi, there's 4 kind of contributions that I'm trying to make in the book. Most of these are contributions to Japan studies. More broadly, on a conceptual level, I'm trying to reach beyond sort of comparative Japan studies to folks who are working more on questions of human rights and things like that. First, what I'm trying to do is by tracing Toshi's active first personal voice, I'm trying to provide a bridge between the body of scholarship that concerns Imperial Japan and the body of scholarship that focuses on Transwar memory cultures. I'm also trying to make visible this longue durée of visual culture in Japan, visual cultures of war in Japan, which began as early as the 1860s and stretched considerably well after the post-war, certainly till the 1980s, arguably even until the present period. So kind of trying to get beyond that dark valley kind of way of looking at things. I'm also interested in thinking through the development of this group of kind of literature called Literature for Little Citizens, Shokukunin Bungaku. This whole movement in the pre-war and trans-war period and its reorientation and redeployment in the 1980s as a kind of global multiculturalism, so looking at kind of the war and Cold War roots of that logic in Japan. And then finally, the biggest thing is I'm trying to think about ways in which you can engage artwork generally and a museum specifically as sites of ethical engagement. So today I'm just going to share a sliver of that big project with you, bits and pieces taken primarily from Chapter 5. In Chapter 5, what I'm doing is I'm working through a whole set of debates that were really active in Japan from 45, certainly until about 1985 or so, called Bijutsu ni Miru Sensou Sekinin. So the artistic wartime responsibility debates is what those are. So this is the ongoing struggle of Japan to come to terms with its active and aggressive wartime activity. So by exploring Toshi's struggles to confront her own past, the chapter explores these still unfolding understandings of justice as meted out by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the IMTFE, and is mitigated through Japanese media coverage from the 40s and 50s. And I sketch out the Buddhist origins and post-war political reappropriations of this idea of Hansei, which is critical self-reflection. And that discourse of Hansei continues to be important in Japanese language discourse, definitely through the 1990s, and still today. So anyway, payoff is I'm going to make an argument rooted in this woman's life and experiences and demonstrated through her artwork for an ethical position called persistence. But I'm going to do that by going back to the quote on the opening slide. This idea that this GI has dropped the bomb and toppled the fascist, but knows nothing about art. All right. So there's I skipped that slide. This is the wartime responsibility stuff. All right, so back to the quote. All right, you're from a civilized country and you dropped the atomic bomb and toppled the fascists. Thank you, but you know nothing about art, she says to an American GI in 1987. So the scene for this is downtown Tokyo. The time is spring of 1947, early in the US-led occupation of Japan. The artist, Toshi, is in her mid-30s and she set up a sketchboard, pencils and paper atop the Tsukiya Bridge in the heart of the popular shopping district of Ginza. Here she is later on top of that same bridge. She was competing with the so-called pon-pon girls, or street prostitutes, for the attention of young GIs, offering to make sketches of the men or of photographs that they had of their wives and girlfriends who lived far away. Though by no means well off at the time, she was earning enough income from her newspaper articles, illustrated vignettes, children's books, and magazine illustrations like that one, to pay the rent, to feed herself and her husband Edie, to buy art supplies, and to rent exhibition space for showing her oil paintings. She was also saving up the money needed to found a new arts organization called the Zen-ei Bijutsukai, the Avant-Garde Arts Association. What the man atop the Tsukiya Bridge likely wanted was something called a silk scroll portrait. Here's an example of one. This sort of hyper-realistic genre of painting, a little bit like a personalized pinup, that was marketed as exotica to American servicemen stationed in Japan. But what he got was something more like this, a genre of caricature in Japan called fushiga, a genre in which Toshi was really skilled and freshly interested. She had been a poor temple kid from rural Hokkaido when she started art school in 1933, and she paid her way through school by doing caricatures of day trippers to Tokyo's Ueno Park. Just the year before she did the caricature for the GI, she had actually also completed a series of caricatures of Class A war criminals when she was covering the International Military Tribunal as a stringer for the communist newspaper Akahata. And I'm going to tell you a lot more about that in a minute. She also published several post-war articles on the value of the caricature as a means for producing and supporting democratic society. And those she collected later in her book, Ei wa Dare de mo Kakeru, Anybody Can Make Art, which I'll pass around. In its worm-eaten state. There you have a copy of it. So just kind of to summarize what she says in those manifestos and what she covers in this book, Anybody Can Make Art. She makes a defense of caricatures. She says that there's something about sketchwork in general and about the practice of looking closely at people and drawing what you see that fosters a kind of honest reciprocity and commits a kind of social leveling. So when she shows the GI this caricature that she has done of his girlfriend, he was disgusted and he wadded it up and he went to throw it off the bridge into the water below. And she reaches up and she grabs his hand and she says, "You're from a civilized country and you dropped the atomic bomb and toppled the fascists. Thank you. But you don't know anything about art." And apparently he laughed and he flattened it out and he stuck it in his wallet and walked off. He may have thrown it away later, we don't know. But at any rate, she kept him from throwing away there by her joltingly frank sense of his poor aesthetic judgment. So in the book, I treat her life as a case of what microhistorians call the exceptional normal, scaling up from the details of her lived experience to address these key issues in modern Japanese history and culture. So in that sense, the book is a work of Alltagsgeschichte, right? This German school of the history of everyday life that concentrates on 20th century dictatorships and especially on the relationship of common people to fascist regimes. As with the Italian approach, microhistoria, German and Anglophone microhistories begin with an assumption of agency. And this is something I think is really important. This is the idea that individual people aren't just expressions of structural conditions of violence such as empire, but are rather conscious actors who make day-to-day decisions about how to conduct their lives. In this sense, I think microhistory is a helpful and also a useful tool because, as microhistorians would argue, this is a quote, instead of only pointing out oppressive structures that cripple and kill people, microhistorians highlight how people build, maintain, erode, and can eventually destroy structures. So that emphasizes agency and ability to act in the moment, but also responsibility both for the past and to the future. Like so many other people of her era, Toshi made a life that stretched across the meteoric rise and spectacular fall of the Japanese Empire, and in that she was totally normal. What's extraordinary about her is all the stuff that shows up in her closets, and these are literally things I pulled out of her closet. She left rich and varied evidence of her activities: sketches, diaries, oil paintings, notes for speeches, books, journal articles by the hundreds, actually a recent tally is 1,200, photographs, and the like. So her story is a compelling example of how an individual human being navigated the historical landscape of big events in the context of their own small day-to-day life. So the overarching concern of the book is to explore how this artist not only lived, but remained socially engaged. She published actively, even relentlessly, across the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. She had something coming out almost every single day of the year. It's kind of crazy. I don't know when she slept. As historian John Dower has noted, both in popular discourse as well as in academic writing, the overwhelming tendency when discussing wartime culpability in Japan has been to resort to a plural passive structure. Damasareta, right? We were fooled, is the popular post-war mantra. A rhetorical habit of clinging to the passive voice that leverages culpability for the war onto a small mastermind group of military officials and political elites. It's a rhetorical habit that also continues, obviously, to exacerbate Japan's contemporary relations with its erstwhile colonial possessions and military targets in the East, Southeast, and South Asia. So one of the main reasons that I think Toshi's story is so compelling, both on an intellectual and a personal level, is that she she struggled to confront this plural passive voice, and in fact came to acknowledge her own wartime activities and their moral implications. So here comes the section where I actually give you an example. You're waiting for the rubber to hit the road. This is when it happens. I can talk for hours and hours and hours about Toshi, and if you give me a beer tonight, do not get yourself into a corner, because then I will talk to you for hours and hours and hours about it. So put me in the corner so that you can escape. Also, thanks to the Maruki Gallery, the Kotsen Library, the Praying Archives, the National Diet Library, the Library of Congress, the Maruki family, Toshi's family temple, and about 20 libraries across Japan, I have a whole bunch of pictures. I even have notes from her grandma. But I don't have hours and hours right now, so I'm just going to focus in on one little moment in her broader movement. And that is the moment where she attends the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. So she attended it on at least 2 occasions, producing an illustrated column for the communist newspaper Akahata, the Red Flag, and a full-length article in The People, or Jinni, a socialist organization. She also wrote a few other occasional pieces about it. So what this means is that she witnessed firsthand the machinations of international justice, the parsing of guilt and implication, and the unfolding for the legal parameters of the term Senso Hanzani, or war criminal, right, abbreviated as Simpan in Japan. The IMTFE was open to the public. Passes to the trials, like that one up there, AM1, could be picked up at any of 3 locations in Tokyo, 2 in Yokohama on the military bases there, or written, often requested by mail. Holders of the small pinkish slips that served as spectators' passes were entitled to view 1/2 day's proceedings and were seated according to nationality. You've got a photograph there from the back of the room showing the Japanese seats on the left the Japanese seats on the right and the international seats on the left. So Toshi's descriptions, and here I'm actually treating her newspaper articles as examples of literature. Toshi's descriptions of entering the courtroom, which she illustrated for Akahata, read like a science fictional account of a port call on another planet. I'm going to give you a bit of an extended close reading. She writes, "As soon as I entered the courtroom, the first thing I felt was the freezing cold of the air conditioning. Because there were no fans running, the harsh overhead lights shone down directly on us. The news cameras rolled along smoothly. In the witness stand stood Professor Bates from Nanking University, narrating the shameless horrors of the marauding Japanese army." This is the section right here. Just translate it. Toshi's top sketch of the scene, where the green arrow is, shows the bank of judges seated below the flags of the 11 prosecuting nations, and a group of seated lawyers and a military police officer standing watchful on the floor below them. A second sketch, just below it, shows the dock of defendants. Both sketches are crowded, thick not only with bodies, but also with the signs of technological prowess and mediation. So there's a movie camera rolling in the upper left-hand corner, a communications receiver flashing at top right, microphones on tripods standing witness by both lawyers and defendants, with their pointed angles echoing the rigid stances of the MPs and the triangular peaks of the flags. And you'll notice that nearly everyone seems to hunch over, huddled in concentration with these huge earphones clamped to the sides of their heads. So at first glance, there's nothing that seems natural or human about this situation. This is justice served cold, right? Sort of literally cold. Toshi played up these sensations of technological and civilizational displacement in her much lengthier write-up for Jinni, which she included a very similar illustration for. For that venue, she began her article at the train station where she was trying to purchase a ticket to get to the trials. The clerk at the ticket window keeps trying to send her to Sugamo, which is where the political prisoners were being held. And she has to explain over and over that Sugamo is the detention facility, whereas she is trying to get to the trial itself in Ichigaya. Having finally received a ticket to the correct destination, she heads to the platform, thinking, quote, "This tribunal is such a critically important event and everyone's talking about it. When it comes right down to it, no one in Japan seems to know where it's actually taking place. Unbelievable." End quote. So she arrives at Ichigaya Station, which is at the bottom of the hill there, that the jeeps are going up. And she asks the station master for directions. He tells her to follow the jeeps, right, up to a giant gray building. And she recalls that the building is actually dark gray because during the final days of the war, its exterior had been splashed with black ink so it would be less of a target in the endless airstrikes. The ink, she notes, has yet to wear off. She climbs to the top of the hill. There's this giant sign that reads "Tomare," right, halt. She produces her pink pass and is astonished when the GI says, okay, and just lets her in. She's like, oh my gosh. So these are the introductory paragraphs of her essay. And she pens them as a step-by-step how-to guide for people who want to attend the trials. So this is a democratic gesture. You want to go see these trials. Here's how you get the tickets. Here's how you get the pass. Here's how you get from the station to the trial space, all that kind of stuff. The framing remarks also pick up on her thoughts, which I examined at length in an earlier chapter of the book, about the importance of not erasing. So in describing sketchwork as an ethical practice, she argues at length that you should never erase your mistakes. She says, quote, what's behind that way of dealing with your mistakes isn't about facing up to them or critiquing them. It's a gesture of embarrassment, of wanting to cover them up. The mistake is not going anywhere, though. Even if you rub it out or cover it over, you can't fool yourself into thinking that just because you can't see it, it's not there. So similarly, the dark ink stains marking the Ichigaya court building, formerly the headquarters of the Japanese Imperial Army, provide for her a stark visual reminder, this kind of lasting ocular clue to the many casualties and violent incursions of the recently concluded war. If the outside of the building, the tower which you can see in the far left there, is a reminder of Japanese mistakes that can't be rubbed out, the interior of the building represents for Toshi a nearly fantastical realm, awesome in its power and innovating in its foreignness. As soon as she passes through the gates, she becomes uncomfortably self-conscious about her own appearance. She notes how the group of US soldiers walking by has ramrod-straight legs and nice crisp uniforms, and she finds herself standing up a little bit straighter and wishing that she had had a chance to wash her clothes before she came. When she enters the building, she then starts riffing on Buddhist metaphors. So she writes, quote, it was just like entering the Dragon's King's palace. I'll explain that in a minute. The doors swung open, and the moment I stepped inside, I was struck by a cold silence. There they sat, some 600 people, each one a little bit different. I stood there not knowing what to do. So she's coming in the back of the courtroom. There they were, all lined up, the flags of those civilized countries, of Bunmei no Kuni, the 11 allied nations, shining red and glittering gold. I got the sense that I shouldn't just stand there in the aisle, so I found an empty seat in the Japanese observers' areas and sat down. At first, it seemed like everything was utterly silent. But as I settled in, I began to hear from somewhere behind me the clear voice of the translators and of the questioners and of the people being questioned. There were these voices, but I couldn't see anybody's mouth moving. Nobody seemed to actually be speaking. Who was it that was doing the talking? In this perfectly cool, crisp atmosphere, there was a man at the front of the room making sweeping gestures. And then I noticed this flashing red light on the desk in front of him. Aha! He's being translated right now. And then blink, 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 the red light flashed on the desk in front of the judges, lined up before the 11 flags. And I heard this thick, heavy, somewhat sensual voice of the Chief Justice. And then the light started flashing again. Sounds like Star Trek, doesn't it? So she's listening really closely to Joseph Keenan, the U.S. Assistant Attorney General and Chief Counsel for the prosecution, as he speaks in English. And she's not able to follow what he says. Her impression, she says, is of listening to a well-performed recitation of Buddhist text, a dodori, of the sort one might hear at a ceremony, for instance. Finally, taking a cue from everybody else, though, she raises this set of earphones to her head and clamps them on tight. And suddenly, as soon as she does this, she sees the gestures of the man in the front of the room, and she hears his voice booming in her mind. And she describes it as almost like telepathy. The words start to come through in translation, and as they do, she's watching Tojo, in this instance, listening to his sentence being given. She says, as they do, quote, that old man in the docks swallowed. Even the sub-vocalizations of the witnesses for the defense couldn't fail to be heard. And there were no distracting background noises either, just that crisp, quiet, the red light from the receivers blinking on and off, and the voices of those testifying being transmitted into my mind. There were 2 glassed-in boxes, inside of which women, each with a glistening blonde B-52 hairdo, took memos. The ceiling was lined with lamps that lit up the room, each and every corner like a goldfish bowl illuminated by a searchlight. The lights beat down, showing every wrinkle and crease, and there was a slithering liquid sort of machine rhythm of the film moving through the high-grade camera. The defendants bleeped rapidly under the onslaught of bright lights. So she feels herself to have entered another realm that is powerful, foreboding, and strange. And she calls it the Dragon King's Palace. So here's where I get to geek out a little bit about Buddhist stuff. The Dragon King's Palace, according to Buddhist-inspired legend, is a land under the sea. It's a place where the teachings of the Buddha are perfectly preserved in a library of total insight, the chief librarian for which is, in fact, a dragon. That's awesome. Just to mention. Right. The visionary few can actually be taken by the dragon down underneath the sea into the library. And there you can request to permanently check out a book which will correct human knowledge in the Turanian world. Right. So the Dragon King himself, as depicted in classical Japanese works like the Genji Monogatari, the Tale of Genji, is kind of a sexy, sensual figure. He slithers up out of the sea and he addresses people and he comments on how handsome they are. He kind of likes the young men, and he gets them to come back under the sea and shows them his library. So what Toshi is doing here, she was a temple kid, right? She's setting up an extended metaphor whereby she, and through her readers, visit a realm of technological, civilizational, and moral superiority, suggesting both that Western dominance and the desire to as well as the desire to cast off fascism are kind of dominating her artistic priorities, and she's being part of a mission to set the record straight. She sees the IMTFE courtroom then as a place that's cool and crisp and strange and unfamiliar, hidden in plain sight at the edges of the normal world. A place where customs and languages are unfamiliar and where everyday human being can feel small and insignificant. A place where major decisions are made which will have impact on the everyday world beyond these walls, though that world seems to vanish as soon as you're not there. So it's a proximate realm of technological power and machinery of justice. And as she comes back from this notional metaphorical trip to the Dragon King's palace, she writes that she's deeply disturbed by the fact that she can't recognize Tojo, right, General Tojo. She thought he had been so familiar. She'd seen pictures of him in the newspaper day in and day out for the last 10 years. And she writes, quote, "Where was the defendant, Tojo?" He's the guy far right. Was he that one there at the very end? The guy with the buzz cut and the pince-nez glasses and the khaki uniform? Was that him? Or was it the one 2 seats further down the row? Or 2 seats beyond that? But honestly, they all look to me like they could be Tojo. So she finds that Tojo and his cohort aren't gods of war as the popular wartime accolades had them, but less than human. As she continues to look at the person she eventually identifies as Tojo, she describes him as nothing more than a flap of skin pulled tight across a skull. And it's at that moment, caught between the twin emotions of awe at the technological prowess of the IMTFE prosecution and disorientation at not being able to discern the individual Japanese defendants, that she takes out her pencil and starts to sketch. Why? So obviously the quick answer is that she's an artist. That's what she does. She sketches things. But what I'm interested in is getting at the question of what work does she understand herself to be doing with her pencil. So as she conceived of it in this book-length memoir that I was passing around, Eiwa Darede mo Kakeru, okay? There it is on the far right. This technique of sketching works on 2 fronts at once. On the one hand, close sketch work reveals the subject's individual interior emotional world. So in a specific discussion in that book of her IMTFE drawings, she wrote, quote, "At the port, in the field, in palace chambers," she's talking about the Dragon King's palace, "above the clouds, in the weed-grown lots of burnt-out city ruins, and in thickets of bamboo. Person, artist, faculty for raw, naked sensation. Ningen gakka supadaka no nananamashi kankaku no mochibushi. In the ideas of a skilled artist, it's all color, all a collection of subject matter. At the IMTFE, in an air-conditioned room surrounded by the height of the summer, the red flash of receivers rebels, disturbing the tranquility of a civilized court of law. The defendant Tojo sits there immobile, as if already a corpse. He's no match for the orderliness of the proceedings and the atmosphere of democracy, with its quick flashes of wit and even humor. There's simply no way in which a character of that sort can stand up to it. Indeed, the former sense of self seems to be utterly driven away. And then, suddenly, he wipes sweat from his face. Sweat in this cold room. So here Toshi is positioning the naked regard of her sketch practice as performing much the same work as the civilized, or so-called civilized protocols of the court of law. The exaggerations of her lines, perhaps somewhat amusing in their deformation, mirror the jocular wit of the courtroom, a humor which was unfortunately deleted in the post-censorship version of the article. Just as a court of law has the power to arraign any person as a defendant, the sketch artist, through her faculty for raw naked sensation, has the prerogative to summon anyone as a sitting subject. Training her artistic gaze on Tojo, she removes him from his wartime position of merely sacred inviolability, drawing the lines and curves and shadows of his face just like anyone else's. And her sketch work, functioning in tandem with the juridical process of questioning, brings forward one fact or one line into the light at a time in order to build up a portrait of a man. A man who ultimately, she finds, is no match for this process of civilized but cold and unsparing scrutiny. A man who reveals himself to be sweating, even in the cold room. So if, as Toshi suggests elsewhere, the scariest thing in the world is an absolutely straight line, by extension, the scariest human visage is a face that has no humanity, a face that's nothing but a mask of arrogance. And that's why it's so disconcerting for her at first to not be able to recognize Tojo, because it means that she can't see him as a human being. She sees, or when she first gets to the courtroom, she thinks that Tojo and Itagaki and Hoshino and Kido and Kimura and all the other Class A war criminals are interchangeable until she starts to sketch them. And then she begins to see their individuality. And these are some parenthetical notes on the back of her sketches. She writes, Tojo's veins, the way his skin is stretched tight over his jaw and cheekbones. Minami's mustache seems to droop when he listens closely. Kaya, got a bit of fight left in him. Hoshino can't seem to sit still, takes off his glasses, peers up at us in the booths with his incredibly nearsighted eyes. Itagaki keeps looking across the public seating area, worried that his wife has come. Her notes on the back. All right, so going back to that opening quote once more. What I'm arguing here is that Toshi is conceiving of caricature as a counter to fascist realism and sketching as a riposte to war documentary paintings, or a genre called Senso Sakusen Hirokuga, which you see an example of there. The war documentary paintings had emerged in 1937 to 1945 Japan as a form of public art, generally rendered on these really large canvases, 72 by 100 inches wide, and executed by Jugunka, military service painter. They were meant to accurately portray military campaigns in realistic detail, and yet be more than a photographic copy of the subject. Being more than just documentary quality, they were supposed to combine that quality, the kirokuse, with a strong artistic appeal to the emotions. The government actually specifically recruited artists trained as Western-style oil painters, like Toshi, right? Because of the emphasis that training placed on pictorial realism. Between 1937 and 1945, several hundred war documentary paintings were produced. Many of them are still in Washington, D.C., with artists directly sponsored by the Army Art Association and the Navy Art Association, as well as other propaganda units. While on tour to observe the war and to complete sketch studies, artists enjoyed officer-level accommodations, and back at home, they received preferential access to exhibition space and to art supplies, as well as the benefits of publicity and media. In fact, the Navy had tried to recruit Toshi to go on one of these painting tours of the Solomon Islands, and she forged a doctor's note. Anyway, back to the courtroom though. Toshi then, for her sketch work, Back to the courtroom, Toshi's sketchwork comprises a concerted deconstruction of the imperative to verisimilitude, or kyokusei, as practiced in the war documentary painting, with its demands to leverage realistic detail toward emotional nationalistic appeal. Instead, she went for a genre of caricature, fushiga, in the aesthetic mode of deformation, or deforme, which she saw as liberatory techniques tied specifically to the political form of democracy. Over the course of the 50s and 60s, she and the Zene Bijutsukai artist group, which she helped to found, called out any number of war documentary painters as military colluders. And then there's this fantastic curveball. She's being interviewed in 1989 in the lead up for being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by a journalist named Usami Shoal. And she stops in the middle of the interview and says, and this is an interview that's being transcribed, is going to be translated into English and Swedish. Why Swedish, right? Nobel Peace Prize. So she stops in the middle of the interview and says, out of nowhere, "Watashi wa senpai no sensou daisou no ehon o kaita no." She says, actually, I'm a war criminal. I illustrated a book that glorified the war. And she clearly knows what a war criminal is, right? She saw firsthand as a war criminal was being defined. So the journalist is really stunned. And he presses the issue in a further interview. And what he's done is some good archival research where he discovers not only one, but actually several wartime children's books that she has illustrated, some of which I'll pass around you to look at. And they go back and forth discussing what in the world she could have been thinking. They talk about several of the illustrations. They talk about what the illustrations meant at the time. They talk about how the books had been used to recruit child warriors, kids as young as the age of 10, to go into the military. Finally, after several hours of interviewing here, Asami asks, "Why did you take the job?" And Toshi says, "I hadn't had anything to eat." So there's one of her books. And there's her self-portrait the same year that she did the books. So she said, "I hadn't had anything to eat." So I can't do full justice to that complex exchange here. There's a long story in another chapter of the book about Toshi's time in the Japanese mandate in Micronesia, the differences between the sketches that she produced there, the diaries that she produced there, and the notes that she took on the backs of those sketches, versus the official accounts that she published in state-sponsored press upon her return. Let's just say that she was a remarkably good self-censor. And if you'd like to hear more, there's always dinner tonight, or you can read the book when it comes out. But by way of a broad conceptual conclusion, what I'm trying to do in the book by telling stories like this, complicated stories like this, with lots of curveballs, is to put some pressure, conceptual pressure, on this whole cluster of notional categories of agency, complicity, resistance, and resilience. And I swear I'm winding up here. More specifically, by telling Toshi's story, I'm marking out this position called persistence. Located somewhere in the messy and muddled gray area between complicity and resistance, persistence shares certain qualities with resilience, a commitment to not disappearing, a fierce act of continuing to take up space. Right? Sometimes just staying alive has its own resistant edge. Unlike resilience, however, persistence is not rooted so firmly in precarity. Persistent subjects may act from compromised positions and enjoy the privilege of problematic associations with the classes and peoples in power, as in fact she did in Micronesia, taking full advantage of the colonial structures there. Persistence occupies adjacent, proximate, or overlapping territory with that of the reluctant colonizer, perhaps, but is a bit more radicalized. Right? The hallmark is not a potentially entirely private emotional position of ethical discomfort and reluctant co-optation, but rather an emphatically public-facing position of cultural production, and insistence on continuing to look and to comment on what has been seen. And again, she published something nearly every single day between 1935 and 1952. Similarly, persistence takes some of its cues from strategic essentialism, sort of pragmatic shuck and jive of staying just this side of the law and of staying alive, insofar as persistent subjects make use of the cultural expectations and stereotypes and assumptions to make room for themselves, and to do so in a manner that can seem, with the benefit of hindsight, to be unseemly, bigoted, opportunistic, and even racist. But persistence is maybe a bit edgier than strategic essentialism and more apt to push the bounds of what's legal or permissible, in part because persistent agents typically enjoy more stability and more privilege. They can get away with it. A final characteristic of persistence is that it's in constant contention with structural violence. And I'd be happy to unpack this image if you'd like me to later. While the study of persistence requires a microhistorical approach in that persistence happens at the individual level, to tell a story of persistence is at one and the same time to tell a story concerning structural violence. Persistence is hard, daily work, and is at times disregarded or underpaid work. But it's work that matters because it's through persistence that people build, maintain, erode, or eventually destroy structures. Finally, though, there's nothing at all clean or simple about persistence. This is not resistance by another name. There's a core principle at work. You have to stay alive, and you have to stay at some degree of liberty. The question of how far a persistent agent is willing to go in order to preserve her life and to ensure continued liberty of communication and exhibition and publication opens onto a very tangled and complex terrain of moment-to-moment decision-making and compromises. And the book tells the story of one such set of compromises, and through tracing Toshi's life, traces the contours of what it took to master the art of persistence in Transwar. That's it.
I'm going to open the floor to questions. We have about 7 minutes left. We can pull 10.
Okay, sorry.
I think several people have to be at places pretty soon after. So,
Maybe gather.
any questions?
I see Rose's hand up.
Well, we'll
Does
let Rose start.
anyone other than Rose have a question? Because I talk to Rose all the time. Yes. Okay. I'll get to you, Rose. Yeah.
You were talking about how all the things use an instrument for the military. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, so just briefly, oil painting first came into Japan through contact with the Dutch and Portuguese at the port of Nagasaki. The same people who were sent abroad on ships as oil painters were also sent abroad as cartographers. They were using the same kind of military and mathematical skills to create maps as they were to create three-dimensional portraits. And so when the technique of oil painting came into Japan, it came into Japan along with the techniques of perspective. And so it was understood to be a militarily sensitive art form that was akin to mapping enemy territories and territories for colonization. Yeah. So you actually, to go to study oil painting in Japan from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, you actually had to go to a government-sponsored school that had military connections.
There's a question here.
Okay. Well, okay. So I guess my question is, first of all, this is like a super sophisticated, like analysis of the work, and I find it really remarkable. And I guess my question was, do you see some kind of parallel of her life and career among Japanese artists who approximately experienced the same, periods? And I think one person I can think of is Kazuma Yuki.
Yeah.
And I think she was like almost like a perfect parallel, because she also worked for propaganda art during the war era, and after war she became active, although very nuanced critique of ideologized art. And her main tool of critique, as I got that from Namiko's book, is that she was really criticizing the format of realist oil painting with the kind of semi-nativist folkloric wit rooted in the Japanese culture, which is kind of similar to the caricature, that was close to Fukushima. So I think these two are very interesting parallels. So do you see that as a larger part of larger career for Japanese artists, or is she?
There are a few people who managed to do this, right? So Katsuba Yuki is one. There may be 6 or 8 artists who published as relentlessly. Well, I think she was the one who published the most relentlessly throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. A lot of the other folks, like Katsura Yuki and folks, tended to go a little bit more quiet during 37 to 45. Katsura Yuki was one of the few who stayed sort of emphatically public-facing and managed to also then create a post-war profile for herself as an anti-war artist, right? So there's an interesting series of kind of about faces that go on there. So I'm not trying to suggest that Toshi was alone in this, but that she's got the most varied archive of material that you can go into to really unpack this. And she traveled a lot. I mean, she was in Micronesia, she was in Moscow, she was in all of these different places. She was a settler colonial herself by birth, and so she's got a lot of kinds of material that some of the other artists don't really bring to bear. But she's not completely unique. All right, Rose, go ahead.
Thorn in the side. I was just really interested in that moment you were describing at the trial, because I've sat through a kind of analogous moment like that, which is at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And one of the things that I find really interesting about that, what you were arguing, was that the scariness of it doesn't seem to be about, it's about authority, but it's not the security of authority. To me, it's about the fact that it's one of those moments where you realize that the authority can be very mobile and suddenly switch to the wrong side. And I'm just wondering if that's related to that knowledge of persistence, that you can't always read how things are going to go. Now, nobody at the TRC was going to say that apartheid wasn't evil and all of those things, but a lot of the defendants, they're not defendants because of the structure of the TRC, but a lot of the war crimes perpetrators were extremely charismatic. And were still charismatic in that presence. And so to me that authority or that scariness is not, it's kind of about like you don't know how to follow. And then when people like Aiki and Croft write about the TRC, they say the fact of the matter is in order to get into a sense of the personality of the perpetrator, you have to kind of let go judgment and live with them a little bit. And it seems to me that that's what she's doing in her painting. And so I'm just wondering if there is some relationship between persistence and the scary mobility of authorities within a room.
Absolutely. Yeah, and
If that made any sense.
Yeah. No, she was pretty clear about taking advantage of the scary mobility of authority throughout her career. It's how she got, so she, you know, when she was working as an elementary school teacher, she's like, I could continue to do this and I would die on the vine as an artist. Or I can look to my college classmates who are the son and the daughters of diplomat families and military families, and I can write on their coattails and get myself a job. And so she made any number of decisions over the course of her life to not stay clean. One of the things that was scary for her in the trial is, in fact, and this is something I unpack in the chapter, there was a blanket statement issued about the search for war criminals, and it included people who were active in the propaganda units. And insofar as she herself had published, you know, these children's books, there was a real concern and a real uncertainty about who was going to get pulled before and who was going to get pulled into war criminals. As it turned out, they didn't go into cultural producers. Trials didn't put folks like that on trial. She herself did, though, right? So she was at the forefront of this movement, this arts group that she founded, the Zinni Jutsukai. They actually singled out any number of other artists for having produced war art. One of the people that they singled out the most was the guy who did, where is it? Oh, sorry. The guy who did the tanks here, a guy named Fujita. And she actually knew Fujita. She spent time at his house. She got art supplies from him, right? So she knew him really, really well. So the degree of culpability was incredibly close to her. And I think she was kind of trying to jump between ships as she needed as that authority, the scary authority. She also wrote, I didn't translate this part in today's talk, But she was really worried about the U.S. And the Allied nations, the 11 Allied nations prosecution and how far it would go, whether it would turn into its own kind of dictatorial machine. Yeah, which
talking about witnessing of war crimes trials opens up a great comparative dimension, right?
Yes.
Where we can compare these reports, this witnessing with other situations, and other literature and art that came out of such, of course, Krug's Country by Skull. But of course, what's striking about this report is, as an artist, she really focuses on the visual, right? The color of the building, can I see this guy? Can I recognize this guy's face? And it's interesting she mentions Tojo's seeing his picture, whereas like Adorno and Horkheimer, when they talk about Hitler, they talk about the voice. This was the voice that Germans heard on the radio, every day, and that's how we recognize it. If you have Peter Weiss going to the Frankfurt trial, he's interested in the stories and the interactions between, the witnessing that comes out of the trial that seems to be absent from what you've reported on. And so there seems to be this great mythological depth, right, of the Dragon King, of House of the Dragon King, which is, ambiguous, of course. It's positive and negative at the same time somehow. And there seems to be this totally surface, visual reporting on there. And what I'm missing in between is the kind of ethical, interpersonal dimension of what's being revealed, right, by this testimony.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a little.
Sure. So one of the parts that I didn't translate is her cover. So she went on at least 2 days, and I would guess maybe more like 3 or 4. One of the days that she went was the start of the trial that was detailing the rape of Nanking, which her cousin fought in, as well as one of her close friends who was a fellow artist fought in. And so she records in her account of that sort of the shock of hearing spoken aloud, the things that she knew were being done that we weren't talked about. And she writes pretty movingly in a pretty detailed way in her diaries and then later in some of her published writings, where she says, we knew what people were doing. We knew exactly what people were doing, and we didn't talk about it. And for that, she says, we're all going to hell, right? She's a minister. We're all going to hell. And so she actually has one of the final pictures of this nuclear series is called Hell. It's called Jigoku. And it shows Hitler, and it shows Mussolini, and it shows Tojo falling into hell, and it shows her as well falling into hell. And she's got a piece of tape across her mouth, where she's like holding her finger up, because I didn't say anything, type of thing. So she does get into that aspect of things ahead of time. She also, for the nuclear series, it was very tightly researched. So she went and she did a lot of ethnographic field work and stuff like that. She would find former soldiers as well as former survivors of things and ask them to dress themselves as closely as they could and to narrate what had happened. And in several of the screens, and this is something that I talk about in a different article, she actually places herself, she actually places herself in history. So she is doing some research about, in this one, some US GIs who had been POWs held in Hiroshima who were killed in nuclear bombing. And it turns out that they actually didn't die in nuclear bombings, but before I think right before they were bombed, they were dragged out of their cells and beaten to death by Japanese civilians. And she says, like, yeah, if I had been walking by and someone had handed me a baton, I would have hit the guy. And so it's a horrible image. It's huge and it's really shaky. But so she does a self-portrait in there of her doing that. So a lot of it shows up in these discussions of what she's doing in the screen. And I mentioned briefly that her husband was a surrealist poet. So she and he collaborated not only on the artwork, but also in the captions for the artwork, which are written in the form of surrealist poems and appended to them. And they're mostly just treated as these kind of like didactic materials that they don't have to travel with the artworks. I think actually that they're really important because they're the parts that really get into kind of this interiority.
Well, we've gone past time. So thank you, Charlotte.